This is Jerry Fry, audio historian of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. The following is the professional history of a PPB member told by himself in his own fashion on October the 4th of the year 2010. These interviews are being recorded in order to compile firsthand a living history of the members of our organization and stories of their professional experiences. Many of our members began in what is called the golden age of radio and television, and this is an attempt to preserve as much data as possible for succeeding generations. This recording is not intended for broadcast without first obtaining permission from Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. With me today in Toluca Lake, California, is a person who is not a broadcaster per se, but who has been in and around the broadcasting and motion picture and entertainment fields for many, many years, Dale Olson, well-known publicist in the Hollywood area. Dale, welcome to our audio history session.
I'm honored.
I want to just begin back where we usually begin, where you were born, when, and tell me a little bit about your growing up years.
I have very little memory of anything until I was about 3 years old, primarily because I was, this was in North Dakota. I was an adopted child at almost 3 years, and before that, I was living apparently in a Lutheran home.
Really?
Apparently, I was born to a young couple who were unmarried, but were intending to get married. And the young man was a lineman for the telephone company in North Dakota and had gotten into an accident and died.
Oh.
It was just after the Great Depression. The farm family was a large family, as most of them were in North Dakota. There wasn't too much else to do in the wintertime, which was very cold.
Yes. Warm.
But also, I think the whole idea there was that farm families needed to raise children to help with all of the chores and all the farming activities.
Sure.
At any rate, they were unable, or felt they were unable, to raise another child and put me out for adoption. I was very lucky because a couple named Edwin, named Edith and Arthur Edwin Olson, who were also a farm couple, came along. They wanted a child because, strangely enough, they were unable to have children, despite the fact that my mother, and I will call her always my mother because it's the only mother I knew,
Sure.
and father. My mother was one of 13.
Ooh.
My father was one of 11, and they were unable to have children.
My goodness.
I've always found that rather amusing.
Ironic.
At any rate, my life actually began. You see, I was born in Fargo, North Dakota, in a hospital apparently, but my life really began, and the first thing I can remember was after that adoption, which I learned about much later, of course, but the first people I ever really knew in the world, other than nurses whom I didn't like. I have memories of some kind of a thick needle when I was a child, but that's all I have a memory of till 3, and that's when my life began.
Was this thick needle sticking into you?
It was sticking into me, and I every once in a while still remember that.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I guess I would too.
Things were different in those days. Hospitals were different, and I have a feeling that children in homes were probably not particularly cared for, or not particularly paid a lot of attention to until they got parents, which some of them were lucky enough to do, and I consider myself lucky enough to have them.
So you went to school in North Dakota?
Went to school in a one-room schoolhouse, farm schoolhouse, walking 3.5 miles to school, and that includes the winter time, which was oftentimes 40 degrees below zero, We were covered with sheepskin clothing and throwing snowballs at the other kids as we walked to school.
Just to keep warm, if nothing else.
Exactly.
Yeah, my.
Children are children.
Yes, indeed. Well, that was quite a period in your life. In high school, did you study writing? Where did you first begin to take an interest in that?
It sort of goes back before that in a way. I'll tell you as briefly as I can. My family was a musical family. I mean, this was before we had anything. It was my introduction to radio, of course. Radio was the first thing I can remember at all. I also can remember when electricity came through in our area of North Dakota, and the one light bulb that hung in the middle of the room, which was very excited. And at that time, I also knew, because there was no indoor plumbing, I knew what the Sears Roebuck catalog was really meant to be used for.
And why they published it so often.
Exactly, but only the soft pages, not the slick pages.
No.
But the things that we did after the chores were all done, and when we got together, families got together, everybody played a guitar, somebody plays a piano, and somebody played maybe a banjo or something. And there would be song fests. And we all sang, and I learned to sing when I was a very small child, about 3, and I must have been somewhat precocious because I ended up going around the community and singing at weddings and wedding dances and things like that were the social events in the farming community in North Dakota at that time. I even went to Yankton, North Dakota, and I learned this later. I didn't know who it was at the time, of course, but I found out later when I was told that I sang once with a band leader who became rather famous named Lawrence Welk.
I was going to ask if you knew Lawrence.
Yes, I sang when he was playing for wedding dances at Yankton, North Dakota.
Sure.
But then when I became 5 years old in the adjacent city, which was Valley City, North Dakota. This is about 60 miles west of Fargo and 30 miles north of the South Dakota border. They contacted my parents because they had heard about me. The local radio station was doing a Saturday morning show called the Kitty Club, and they had contacted me about coming in to audition as the kitty. So my parents drove me into, a lot of this is recollection, although I remember the instance of doing this. I was 5 by this time. Drove me in on Saturday morning. I went to the audition. It's the first time I had ever been on radio, of course, and but I had been listening to radio on an old Coronado radio. Mr. First Nighter was my favorite program. I'd listen to people like Les Tremaine and all kinds of great radio people. Olin Soule was Mr. First Nighter. And I learned about show business and all that, so that even though everybody in my family were all farmers, I was the oddball. I was show business from the time I could remember throughout my entire life. That was almost preordained, or as my client Shirley MacLaine used to say to me, well, you were reincarnated.
Yeah.
Well, Shirley MacLaine believed that, and I began to believe it too, because it's sort of, I just knew I was show business. So at any rate, I went in and I sang a song that I had sung everywhere and knew backward and forward, but it was radio and there was a microphone. I'd never had that experience. And the song was You Are My Sunshine. And I was so nervous and so scared that I forgot the words. So the hostess, whose name was Norma Eggstrom, came over to me and she sang it with me. A lot of years later, Norma Eggstrom became better known as Peggy Lee.
Oh, my goodness.
And I've always said that I had the first duet with Peggy Lee.
And it wasn't even recorded.
No.
Oh, dear.
But I thought I was going to become the new Bing Crosby. I mean, I idolized Bing Crosby, whom I heard on the radio constantly. He was what I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I continued. We lost the farm because times were hard, and lots of people were losing their farms in North Dakota in those days. And they, I will never forget, we moved to Portland, Oregon, where my parents could get defense work in those days. I was thrilled because it was the big city. I did not like the farm. I never really, I mean, I milked cows by hand and all of that, did all the chores, but I didn't like them. I was not a farmer by any means. I was meant to be in show business.
Sure.
And so we moved to Portland, and we were kind of like the Jodes. I remember we had an old Ford car piled high with boxes of our things that we hadn't sold. I mean, like everybody else, we had sold everything at auctions and all that. And we're starting a new life. And I have a picture of that car as we drove to Portland, Oregon. In Portland, I went to a somewhat more sophisticated school, and it was there that in some ways my career began, because one day, and I think it was the 6th grade, the teacher decided to ask everybody in the class what their goals were, etc. And most people were talking about what their parents had done, or the girls were going to be hairdressers, or whatever, you know. Mm-hmm. I said I wanted to become a singer, and I wanted to become the new Bing Crosby. After school, he called me, after the class, he called me to his desk, and he said, I have an idea for you. Why don't we find another girl, and I particularly think this girl Lorraine, whom he knew was in my class, put you together with her, and we'll practice a song, and you can deliver it in the assembly, which was a weekly assembly at school. And I liked that. I mean, I think I must have had an ego already or something, because I was ready to go before the public.
Was this high school or grade?
This was the 6th grade.
6th grade.
Mr. Ford, he was the first black teacher in Portland, Oregon.
Oh my
and
goodness.
He was absolutely brilliant, and I consider him very influential to me. Just as in Valley City, North Dakota, when my parents went into Valley City from the farm with their produce to sell on Saturdays, mm-hmm. my mother dropped me off at the library at 4 o'clock, and Miss Swanson there taught me how to read. Wow. And those two people, I think, were the most influential, motivational people in my early life.
Interesting.
Later, she took me to the movies, which was a whole new thing, and that, I mean, it was a new world.
Had you ever seen a black man before in your life?
Yes.
You did?
I didn't understand black men. Mrs. Swanson explained them to me in the library, and I credit her with that, because in the library was a shelf all around the entire room of dolls from all around the world in their native costumes, and she would explain them, and she explained about the different ethnic people. And I've never been a racist or anything, because I totally understood that. But the train came through Valley City at a given time every day, and there were black conductors, and we kids would run down to look, and I knew more because of the library than the other kids, and I explained all them to the other kids.
Oh.
And then I got to talk to them, and it was a wonderful, wonderful motivational experience.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
At any rate, we did our song in assembly, and the kids liked it. And then he said, well, there's this Saturday morning show, Mr. Ed's Stars of Tomorrow. And they performed in the window of the Gill's department store in Portland, Oregon. And I went down there and auditioned. And the person before me, I thought was just terrible. I mean, he was singing loud and strange and all of that. He later became fairly well known as Johnny Ray, who was considered the beginner of of rock and roll.
That's right.
I didn't understand rock and roll. I was Bing Crosby.
Sure.
And I thought he was terrible, but they took him and they didn't take me. Well, I was upset. So I went back and said, this guy can't sing and I can. Anyway, they put me on again the next week, and I sang Now Is the Hour. And so I joined Johnny Ray and a girl named Suzanne Burse, who was a wonderful young soprano, 12 years old at the time, I believe, later became very well known as Jane Powell. And so we were the stars of the show. My billing was "And Little Dale Olson." So that started me on that. But I.
This was a radio show, or
that was a radio show. That was a radio. Television had not yet come in.
No.
It was just about. I think maybe it had come in big cities, but when we moved to Portland, nobody had a television set. No. Nobody had that. However, I had a paper out the first day. Now we moved back and forth. Now we're going to the time when I'm entering high school, my first year in high school, and I got a paper out because we still needed money, and I was peddling my papers one day, and I saw a sign in the Eastern Department Store window with a glamorous picture of this woman in a fur coat and diamonds and all this stuff, and her name was Beatrice Kay.
Mm-hmm.
She was going to sign her records, her Columbia records, the next day at 4:00. Well, it was a star. I wanted to meet this star. I think I missed every paper on my route getting down there, and I ran into the department store, and she was sitting in this big coat on a pedestal, and Lorraine, my little girl who had sung with me before, was in my first high school class, and she was standing there, and I said, "What happened? What's been happening here?" And she said, "Well, she's signing her records and selling them, and the newspaper people have come here and they're interviewing her." And I said, "Interview? What is that?" And she said, "Well, they ask her questions and they take notes and they write a story and it gets in the paper." And I said, "Oh, well, I didn't know what that really meant, but I had been delivered, all the new kids had been delivered a copy of the Jefferson High School Jeffersonian on their first day of school the day before, so I knew that." And I said, "Well, I think I should interview her for the Jefferson High School Jeffersonian."
There you go.
And all that. I didn't really know who she was because I had gone home after seeing the sign, and my mother said to her, "Beatrice Kay is going to be at the department store. Who is she?" And she said, "Well, we heard her on the radio all the time in the Gay 90s hour
review
with Harry Babbitt."
Right.
And, we liked that. And yes, I remember she was, radio, yes. And so now I knew who she was. So now I borrowed a pad and pencil from Lorraine, and I went up, and I said, "Excuse me, Miss Kay, I'm Dale Olson from the Jefferson High School Jeffersonian, and I'd like to interview you." And I'll never forget, she looked at me, and then she looked back at her then husband, who was at the piano. Sylvan Green was his name. And she said, "Well, fine, Mr. Olson, what would you like to know?" I was totally stumped.
I'll bet.
I had no idea, and I said, "Well, what would you like to tell me?" And she smiled, and she was enjoying herself, I'm sure. And I really remember all this totally.
I'll bet you do.
And so she said, "Well, I'm here. I'm appearing at the Cloud Room, which was a nightclub. You're too young to go there, but I would love for you to hear me, but you can hear my records. And she gave me one of her records. Mm-hmm. And I said, thank you. And she said, and I'm going to do my first movie. Oh, I know about movies. What is that? Well, she's going to do a movie called Diamond Horseshoe with Betty Grable. Betty Grable! Oh, I love Betty Grable, I said. Oh, great. Now I had something to talk about. So we talked about the movies and her first movie and all that. Mm-hmm. And I'm writing notes. And I went home and wrote this out with a pencil and a pad of paper. And I wrote the story. I'd never written a story before in my life. Mm-hmm. And I went to the Jefferson, I found it, the editor, and I told him I had done this. And he looked at it and he said, "You wrote this?" And I said, "Yeah, this is." I mean, we talked, and I saw her, and I talked. I got it personal. I wrote it. He printed it, and that was my first story and the start of my career.
And this was what age again?
This was at the age of 14.
14.
Yes.
Oh man.
Then,
I think Shirley MacLaine was right.
Then I continued in school, and one of my clients was the Mayfair Theater, where all the theater companies came to play on tour. I'd never heard of a play before. But Mr. Royster one day said, "Do you want to see the show?" I didn't know what that meant either, because I'd never seen, she said on the stage, I'd never seen a stage show.
Yeah, real
I
people.
said, "Well, sure." So, wouldn't you know it, the show for a 14-year-old, my first show was Carousel.
Oh my.
Now, what better show in the world is there than Carousel for a 14-year-old for his first show? I fell in love.
Sure.
Stephen Douglas and Iva Withers. Iva Withers just had a big piece in the New York Times about a month ago. She's still alive and lives in New York. I found her in the phone book and called her up. And we talked about this. Anyway, now I wanted to see everything, but we couldn't afford it. I mean, the tickets were in the balcony were $1.10. And I mean, these were hard times.
Sure.
And my mother tried desperately to save up enough, and so occasionally she'd give me $1.10 so a new show came. And then Lorene said, "Well, you wrote that story about Beatrice Kay. If you write stories about the shows that you see, or things, or even talk to the people, they'll give you free tickets." Really? So I said, "Well, how do you do that?" And she said, "Well, you have to find some place where they'll print them. I mean, the Jeffersonian will print them, but I think you have to have something else." But they're, So I went to the Oregonian, top paper in Portland, and the Journal, the two dailies. Well, they didn't want a little column by me, or they didn't. They had people to do that.
Yeah. Right.
So they said, "But why don't you go to?" And there was a series of weekly papers. And I went to shorten this and got them to print things free. Mm-hmm. And I went back, I got free tickets, and now I got the $4.40 tickets downstairs, and they let me bring a friend or my mother.
Sure.
And then I started calling up people in Portland. When they came in, they had to be at either the Benson or the Multnomah Hotel. They were the only two decent hotels. Mm-hmm. And everybody said yes. And I interviewed everybody from Toscanini to Marian Anderson to Ronald Reagan to Burl Ives to Catherine Cornell to Vincent Price and the people in the first drama quartet, Charles Boyer, mm-hmm. So Cedric Hardwick, and I knew who all these people were in the movies.
Sure.
All of these people later became friends of mine. Everybody, mm-hmm. And also, I mean, they all said sure. They were either amused that somebody would say for a teenage column, or what did you have to do in those days? There wasn't television. There wasn't anything. You're sitting in your hotel room until it's time to go on stage. Mm-hmm. So. They probably were bored. Everybody said yes. The only person who said no was Katharine Hepburn. Mm-hmm. And when I did finally get her to talk, it's too long a story, but a very funny one. Mm-hmm. And then they would come back every 2 years, and I kept doing that until I got a job on the Oregonian. But they'd remember me, and they'd say, "Oh, it's good to see you, and you're growing up." And so I became friends with the Luntz and Catherine Cornell, and all of them, because they all did the circuit every 2 years.
Sure.
Corneliota Skinner. I mean, everybody. The Toscanini.
And you were there.
Wouldn't talk to anybody. Didn't want to do anything, but he saw me because he was amused. Eisenhower and MacArthur came through. Eisenhower before he was president, and Truman is interesting. Truman came when he was president, and I ran out beyond the police barricade. I was probably 16 by that time, and they stopped me, and Truman said, "Well, let the young man through." He was in a parade, but they had stopped. And I went up and I told him, he said, "All right, I'll give you 5 minutes." And he gave me a 5-minute interview and said, "You got to let these young people he's going to be the future of our country." And that's what I wrote in my column and all that. But everybody saw me.
Yes.
And then I moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career at the end of my high school. Well, after I'd done two years of college and on the college paper in Portland State College.
Portland State?
Yeah, it's part of the Oregon State system. Again, I got a scholarship to the University of Chicago and a scholarship to Williams College, but I didn't dare go to them because I was going to have to work while I was going to school, and I didn't want to be waiting tables at Williams with all the rich kids, and I didn't want to be working while I was going to the University of Chicago because it was too tough a school, and I was afraid I wouldn't be able to handle it. So I turned down those and went to Portland State College because I got a local scholarship for that. Anyway, and then continued my journalism, moved to Portland, still singing periodically, but also trying to get a job. The LA Times, I was making $125 a week on the Oregonian. The LA Times offered me a job in the mailroom for $25, and I couldn't live on that in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. So I got other jobs, but I went out and rounded up my weekly newspapers and wrote things and sent clippings until I got a job as a journalist, which I got from those clippings, and I reviewed all those shows at the Biltmore and all these places. Mm-hmm. But I was still trying to sing, and I was doing some radio appearances in Los Angeles, etc.
As a singer.
Mm-hmm. But one day, a friend of mine, who I forced to come to every performance that I did, or when I did a musical play or something, took me aside after one of them and said, "Dale, as a singer, you're a very good writer." So I got that message, and I became a writer, and was on first Box Office Magazine, then Variety for many years as a general reporter and the drama critic. I founded the Los Angeles Drama Critics Circle, and then I got a call from the Mirage Company, which was the Miramax motion picture of its day. The motion picture company had Some Like It Hot, The Apartment. The first movie that I did was In the Heat of the Night, and I did the Academy campaign as well. I did the whole advertising and publicity campaign. We got 6 Academy Awards.
This was on your own?
No, this is at the Mirage Company. I was publicity director of the Mirage Company.
I see.
I took that because I always thought I was going to be a journalist. Mm-hmm. But I got this offer to be an executive of the most prestigious independent movie company of its time, mm-hmm. at 4 times my salary.
Sure.
So I've always said I sold out for money, and I did, I guess. But I found out I liked doing movie campaigns, and I then went to Rogers and Cowan, the largest independent publicity company of its day. I became executive vice president and also a minor partner for 17 years until I formed my own company, and that's the story of my life.
Wow. Well,
Sorry, I mean, I rambled and rambled and rambled.
You've come a long way since North Dakota, haven't you?
I hated it. I hated North Dakota. I didn't belong there, but I have always been very pleased that I had that experience. I mean, it was grounding.
Yeah.
Yes, in those days we didn't have electric milking machines and all that. We had 12 cows, and my dad and I milked 12 cows by hand every morning, every evening.
Yeah.
I can't say what I usually tell people.
You can say anything.
Well, I've always said I was a great tit man.
Sure. a born tit man.
And I didn't like thrashing, shocking wheat, and I didn't like. I was not a physical person. I didn't like physical labor. I like to read. I like to listen to the radio. I liked music. I was the first person in my family who even thought of classical music and played Lily Pons all the time. My cousins thought I was an oddball. The whole family thought I was an oddball. However they treated me, I mean, remember, being an adopted kid on a North Dakota farm in those days was rather unusual. I mean, that just didn't happen because people, they had huge, families of their own.
Right.
So.
Did your adoptive parents have other children?
I do not know. I know a lot about them, but I was told I never ever chose to find out who they were. I never really wanted to, and as I grew older, I more than didn't want to, because I thought these were teenagers, these kids.
Yeah.
At the time they had me, she probably went on to another life without telling anybody. And it would have been so disruptive and unnecessary for me to seek out that. And also, as I got older, I sort of thought, I kind of like the idea of not knowing genetically whether there are any problems like heart problems or any kind of illnesses, because I really thought that if you know that people are dying in your family out of some sort of genetic illness, you're going to worry about that all the time. You're going to get it anyhow.
That's right.
And I didn't worry about anything, so I thought I was never going to have anything like that.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, but the family who adopted you, did they have other children?
No, they never did have any
children.
other children.
So you had no brothers and sisters?
I have no brothers and sisters. I think I must have been, I know of certain instances, I think I must have been a very difficult, in many ways, child for them because my ideas were different. I mean, for instance, when I was like 8 years old, I started following the plows, as all of the people in the area would plow their fields, because I loved the idea of finding Indian relics. I mean, I had huge collections of Indian tools and sometimes bowls and things like that, arrowheads, tons of arrowheads and weapons and things like that. And then I started going to auctions where families were selling things because they were broke like we were.
Sure.
And I would start buying old things. I wanted old things. I liked the idea of history. I mean, when my uncles would find out that I was collecting the Indian things, they'd sit me down on their knee and tell me old stories of when the Indians were roaming the territories and the buffalo and all of that. I mean, I got James Fenimore Cooper stories before he was born. And I collected antique things, old paintings and things like that. I had a museum in my room. I mean, I bought shelves and shelving to put those things on. I wanted all of these old history things. I found them. I had sets of Haviland china, things, and the auctioneers. It's terrible. The auctioneers would see me coming after a few of these times. They found that very amusing. And books, lots of books, books, a library full of books. They'd say, "What do you want, Dale? Have you picked out your things?" And I'd say, "Yes, I'd have." And they'd say, "On the next lot 25, going, gone to Dale Olson." And they'd sell it to me for 50 cents. Those poor people were selling their treasures, and I was buying them for 50 cents. It was terrible. Today, I think it was terrible. Yeah. Then I thought it was wonderful.
Of course. Coming back to Hollywood now, we can't let you off the hook here. You've got to tell us about some of your favorite clients.
I have had a remarkable life. I mean, a charmed life. It started at the Mirage Company within the heat of the night. Then I became very friendly with Steve McQueen, who later became a longtime client, and I was his spokesperson at his death. In several pictures, and I mean, the Mirage Company had Billy Wilder was under contract, so it was Some Like It Hot, all those Billy Wilder pictures, The Apartment. That's where I met Shirley MacLaine, who became my client for 35 years and part of my family, Zinnemann and John Sturges, Johnny Frankenheimer, Steve Binder. Was making television films for us, and became my client later on. And I was there for 3.5 years until Harold Mirisch died, and I knew that he was the bulk. He was the patriarch of the company. When he died, I knew it was going to reduce itself to Walter Mirisch making one picture, and I was going to be out of a job because it was no longer a big company. It was going to be him alone. And I got a call from Rogers and Cowan, who wanted me to come to work for them. And I said, "I don't even like you. I don't know why I should come to work for you." But they pursued me lunch once a week for 6 weeks, and I kept asking for things, and they kept saying yes. And once again, I just finally said, "Well, I guess I got to try you out." I mean, I guess I was pretty arrogant. And so they hired me as vice president in charge of their entertainment division, except I got there, and they gave me the office and the secretary and, all the equipment. They gave me everything I wanted, plus the salary. Except that was a non-existent job. They just said that.
Oh.
I mean, I got the title, but it was non-existent. All of their other employees, PR people, had their own list of clients. They were independent. There was nothing for me to do.
Oh, boy.
And so Warren Cowan said, "Well, you'll come and be my assistant, and we'll go to all my meetings and all that." Well, I found out what he really wanted was the secretary to come along and take notes. And I said, I've been the head of publicity for the biggest independent company in the business. I'm not going to do this. So I looked at the client list and found out there were several independent companies, film companies, that, and a couple of radio companies, that nobody knew what to do with, and they were doing a terrible job. Well, I'd just been doing all that. So I called up the heads of all those and made luncheon dates with them, and said they were thrilled. They knew who I was. They knew that I knew what they were all about.
Sure.
And so I just gathered them together and formed the motion picture division of Rogers and Cowan, which they didn't have before. And so I did that for 17 years. I did Academy campaigns. I did about 150 movie campaigns. I launched the Rocky movies. I launched the Christopher Reeve super movies. In fact, I discovered Christopher Reeve in a little play in New York. And I went to Cannes every year. I launched the Rambo series. I launched the Halloween series of movies and 150 other campaigns over 17 years. I went to Cannes and headed the Cannes Film Festival campaigns for all the independent companies that I had and all of that, and created my own division. And then one of my clients was Rock Hudson, whom I had met because I had interviewed him in Portland when he was young, and he did Bend of the River with Jimmy Stewart. I was 16 at the time. I had gone up to Mount Hood where they were shooting to interview Jimmy Stewart, who was a star. And as I parked my car and got out, this guy on a horse came barreling down and practically ran over me. And I looked up and I thought, my God, that's the best looking person I've ever seen in my entire life. And he said, who are you? My name's Rock. What's yours? And I said, my name's Dale. And he said, what do you do? And I told him I was here to interview Jimmy Stewart. He said, well, I'm in this picture. Do you want to interview me? And I said, yeah, I think you're going to be a movie star, and I do want to interview you. And 2 years later, I saw him again at the premiere of Bend of the River in Portland, and he remembered me. And that year was the year I went to Hollywood and started getting involved in the career. And a number of years later, he became my client, and then I spent 6 months when I had to announce his AIDS, which was new and all that, and I became.
That must have been a very difficult.
It was the most traumatic things I've ever done. I mean, I announced Natalie Wood, and I announced Steve McQueen, and all of that, and that was. But I began to think that, all my clients. I mean, I didn't want people to know that. I thought they were going to think, going with me, they were going to die.
Yeah.
But Rock was a friend. I mean, he was a lovely man, and I didn't know anything about AIDS, but I had to learn fast because all of a sudden, for 6 months, you could not turn on television or the radio or see a newspaper or anything without me.
Yeah.
Because he was incapacitated.
Right.
I went to him and I said, I went to his doctor. I learned about AIDS and all that. I finally went to him. I said, you've had this great career and everybody's been very careful and they've protected you. We know what your personal life is, and you're going to die. And it's going to get ugly because the tabloids are going to dig up all these things. Let's turn this around and let's make you the hero of AIDS awareness. And he said, how do you do that? I said this on the telephone between him. I was here and he was in Paris. I was going to go to Paris, but I had to be here because the press was, I had to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he finally said, I want you to do that, but you have to be Rock because I can't do it. He was in bed and he was bedridden. I became Rock Hudson to the press. I was the story to the degree that people like Barbara Walters called and said, I need you on 2020. And I said, no, I don't want to do 2020. I don't want to do prepared kind of things. I mean, I'm not looking for publicity for me. I want to do, and she said, I've done all your clients and you're the story and I need you. She virtually talked me. Well, she talked me into doing the show, as did Face the Nation and all these other shows. And what happened is, I got a call from Ronald Reagan when he was president, whom I'd known before I'd interviewed him as a kid in Portland,
Sure.
and I knew him as governor, and I knew him as an actor, and I knew him now as president. A call from him saying, I don't know anything about AIDS, and can I talk to Rock Hudson? Can he tell me about this? And I've always ignored it. I just have thought it was a little personal thing for a group of people. And I said, you mean the gay people? And he said, well, yes. And I said, well, it's not. It could affect your kids. It could affect you. It could affect your wife. It could affect it's affecting people like that all over the world. Mm-hmm. And you need to, the government has ignored this problem. I mean, I became a real activist.
Yeah.
And you have ignored this, and the government has ignored this, and you've got to give us some money. I mean, this needs to be solved. We need to cure this terrible disease before it takes over the world. And he said, well, yeah, and I did arrange for him to talk to Rock by phone in Paris, but that was hard because I had to find out through the doctors when he was not under sedation and when the time. And I'm organizing the president's schedule for that.
Sure.
And he did, and he came back to me, and he said, I just want you to know, Dale, that I have just put through an order for $40 million for research and aid for AIDS. And that was the first governmental money that came through for AIDS. I'm very proud of that.
Boy, I guess.
And Rock was very proud of it. And I am convinced. October 2nd this year will be the 25th anniversary of his death.
For heaven's sake.
We're talking in 2010.
Yeah.
And he is now, a motion picture festival last year called me and wanted to pay tribute to him. And I said, as what? And they said, as the hero of AIDS awareness, but I want to, they made Rock and me the heroes of AIDS awareness. And I'm very proud of that because
I would think
in a way we started this whole thing, and it still hasn't been solved, even though people are living much longer now, and the donations are coming in much smaller because people think in the general, the people think AIDS has been cured.
Yeah,
today.
well, I know. Because people aren't dying as
No,
much
they're
as
not
they
dying.
used to.
Exactly.
Now, if I understand it correctly, the main idea of a publicist is to get the name of a particular celebrity in the press.
It's to create and maintain a career.
But in the case of Rock Hudson, who you obviously knew his lifestyle, it was just the reverse. You wanted to keep that part of the story out of the press.
And it did. He was such a nice guy that the press, which today the press would have been different. Today the press is so totally tabloid, it would have been ugly. But in those days, the press was still, it was pretty decent. And
even though
he was so nice to the press. He was always available. He knew their names. He knew their kids' names. He said hello, how's Mary, how's whoever, and they protected him totally. And there was never scandal, never any scandal. There was one time when there was an attempted scandal which was squashed immediately, and it never lasted. So even when he did he agreed to do the first of a Doris Day Christian broadcasting series, when he looked terrible, and I tried to talk him out of it. I couldn't. He just said, at that time he hadn't admitted. He kept telling me he was anorexic, and I kept saying, "You're dying of cancer," to him, and he'd saying, "Well, I've got a cancer problem." Yes, and his doctor said cancer. But you see, AIDS, you don't really die of AIDS.
No.
I mean, he did die. The death certificate said cancer of the liver. He drank a lot. But it was what's the word I'm having a senior moment? It was accelerated by AIDS.
Yeah.
Because AIDS is acquired immune deficiency.
Precisely.
You don't have an immune system to fight it, and that's what what kills people.
The disease kills you, but AIDS.
Yeah.
AIDS
so
assists in killing.
If you didn't have AIDS, doctors could recover.
Sure.
But you can't.
No.
Anyway.
Boy, that's a fascinating story.
Thank you.
You mentioned you had a Katharine Hepburn story that was interesting.
Do you want my Katharine Hepburn story? We became friends later on. She came through Portland. This was still when I was about 14, I think. She came through Portland in As You Like It, a Shakespearean play in which she plays a male figure. I kept calling her at the Benson Hotel. No answer, no return call, nothing. Everybody else returned my calls, but Hepburn didn't. So I went, she was there for about a week, I think. So I went to her co-stars, who were William Prince, who had done Cyrano de Bergerac with Jose Ferrar, and Pamela, oh God, I'm having a blank. Anyway, she was a well-known actress who had been a quiz kid. I knew who she was, and the grande dame of show business, Estelle Winwood. So every night I went backstage and I interviewed them, and Hepburn's door was open, and she would be staring at us. And finally, after I finished with Estelle, the stage manager came to me and said, "Miss Hepburn is asking for you." It was a summons. It was not, "Would you come and see?" It was a summons to come in. So I went to her door and I said, "Miss Hepburn, I understand you'd like to see me." And she said, "Yes, I would like to know why you are talking to all of my other actors. I'm the star of this picture. Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a journalist with a teenage column, and I've been interviewing them for my column." And she said, "Well, I'm the star of this play. Why aren't you interviewing me?" And I said, "Because you don't answer your telephone and you don't return your calls." She said, "Are you that Dale Olson who's been leaving messages every day?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I am." And she said, "Well, as long as you're here, I guess you should do that." So I said, "All right." So she gave me an hour. And we talked and talked and talked. And years ago, at Rogers and Cowan, a young director came to me who was doing an independent movie called Ali Oxenfree, starring Hepburn, who was playing an older woman who takes two young boys from San Francisco to Los Angeles in a balloon, traveling in a balloon. A charming story. Never really got a release. It crashed in the Hollywood Bowl as part of the movie, playing the 1412, with the symphony playing the 1412 symphony with all the fireworks and all that. Anyway, it was a charming story. And he wanted me to do the publicity. And I said, "Yeah, sure, I'd like to work with Hepburn." And he said, "But we haven't got any money, and I can't pay you." And I said, "Of course not. You're an independent." And he said, "But you could get a piece of the picture." Well, I knew that we'd never get a piece of picture. And Henry Rogers and Warren Cowan. I mean, I was very independent at the agency, but still, I knew they'd just hate me for doing this. But I signed it, and I came back, and Warren and Henry Rogers called it Olson's Folly. Ali Oxenfree is Olson's Folly free.
Yes.
So I thought, well, she has a terrible reputation. The publicist on The Rainmaker had told me that he went up to her on the first day of shooting to introduce himself, and she said, "How do you do? And this will be the first and last conversation we'll have on the picture." She did not like talking to publicists. And I knew that. So I didn't know what to do, but I had worked One of my clients was the beginnings of the Center Theater Group downtown in the Music Center with Elliot Martin, who was then the artistic director. He had hired me, and he had brought over Laurence Olivier's National Theatre Company of Great Britain for 2 seasons, and I bonded with Laurence Olivier, Larry Olivier. He called me. He told me to call him Larry, and we became great friends during those 2 years, and subsequently. And he had just made a television movie called Love Among the Ruins with Hepburn. Mm-hmm. Fabulous movie. And so I called him up in England and said, Larry, I'm going to work with Hepburn, and I'm scared. I mean, I don't think she'll talk to me. She hates publicity, etc. What should I do? And he said, well, I'll tell you what you do. You wait till after she's had lunch, which she'll have alone, and then she's mellow. And you go over to her, and you introduce yourself and say you're my friend, and that I told you to talk to her because you should be friends. And then give her this message from me. I said, are you sure? I mean, won't she just throw me off the set? He said, no, just tell her that's my message to her. So I said, okay. So I waited a week, and I saw her alone on the set over in the corner having her lunch. Afterwards, she was sitting alone. I walked over. I said, excuse me, Miss Hepburn, I'm Dale Olson. I'm the publicist on this picture, and I have a message for you from my friend, Larry, and I made sure to say Larry, mm-hmm. Olivier. And she said, what does that old goat have to say? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, he said to say to you that you're a nasty old bitch and your bark is worse than your bite. He said, what? She said. I said, well, that's what the message is, and he made me promise to tell you. And I promised him because he's a good friend. She said, well. She looked up and down. She said, well, as long as you're a friend of Larry's, I guess we should be friends, and I need somebody to talk to on this picture, so sit down. So I sat down. We were friends, and she did every single thing I asked her to do on that picture, really? Except one. And that was Time magazine. Time magazine arrived on the set one day when I wasn't on the set and went up to her, and she said, have you talked to Dale Olson? And they said, no. And she said, well, I don't do anything unless Dale Olson tells me to. And she threw them off the set. So they called me, and I said, well, why didn't you call me? You know me. And they said, well, we didn't want to talk to you because we thought you'd say no. And I said, I probably would have. No, I said, no, I wouldn't have because she's been very good and all that. Well, she never did the Time magazine piece because she was mad at them.
Boy.
But
story.
And then there are subsequent great Hepburn stories because we became friends for a long time, and she was so difficult and so funny.
But her bark was worse than her right.
Totally. I mean, we used to have. Well, I mean, like, to show you what she was like, she wrote a book called Me, her autobiography. And by this time, the picture's way over. It's years. She's back in Connecticut. And I sent the book to her with appropriate return postage envelope and all that, because I wanted her to sign it to me. Well, she sent it back in the postage envelope that I had provided, unsigned, with a handwritten note saying, I do not sign books that are sent to me because, and she explained why, etc., which was illogical to her explanation. And I thought, this is a lot better than a signed book, this handwritten note.
Right. You got more than you bargained for.
But she was very proper, you see.
Yeah.
She was very proper. Everything had to be very proper.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You know.
I didn't ask you anything about family life. You have family?
I have a 48-year-old son who did not live with me because his mother unfortunately died of cancer when we were both in our early 20s.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
dear.
I was unable to handle that at the time.
I'll bet.
So he was raised by his grandparents, her parents in Boston.
Mm.
I never married
Again.
after that.
Mm.
So I don't have any other family. And I guess I guess I made my work my family, and
Sounds
a
like
lot
it.
of people,
Sure.
my family and all that. I am a very happy person, but I would love to have had some grandchildren, but my son, when he grew up, and I saw him a lot, in the early days. I haven't seen him at all since. He hated Hollywood because his mother was an actress, and he thought that she died because she was an actress. He thought Hollywood was, grew up hating Hollywood
Mm-hmm.
until he was 18, when he called me up one day. I kept wanting him to come and stay with me, etc. And his name was David, and he said, "Dad, I thought maybe could I come out and maybe stay with you in the summer?" I said, "Yeah, but you never wanted to. I mean, what has happened?" He said, "Well, I watch those shows like Entertainment Tonight and news shows and all that, and you're at these events and you always got a gorgeous starlet on your arm. I thought maybe you could introduce me to some girls."
Yeah, he thought his father was going to be good for something.
And
Yeah.
so I said, "Well, I probably could." But then he met this girl that he's lived with ever since.
Uh-huh.
They've been living, I guess it's 25 or 26 years now. They've been living together. They've never married. They don't want to get married. They don't want to have children. All they do, he took over his grandfather's business. He's worth a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And all they do is work and ski.
Oh, but Art.
And we never really bonded after. We
Sure.
never really bonded. I mean, it was an unfortunate thing
Mm.
that happened, and it just affected him. I think
It's-
the death of his mother and not having one
Yeah, that
is
would be
really the reason he never wanted to marry and never wanted to have children.
probably so.
Yeah,
Well, you have
but he has a good life. He does.
you have a large and I'm sure a very appreciative extended family,
I
as they
have
say. Dale, has been a delight talking with you this October 4th of 2010.
Thank you.
Dale Olson has been the subject of this audio history. For Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters, I'm the audio historian. My name is Jerry Fry, and we thank you very much for listening.
And Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters is one of my great loves. Ever since the first day I was invited to a meeting and didn't know anybody at all that was there, but walked through the room and my ears knew everybody.
Yeah, for heaven's sake. Yes, indeed.